All right. Welcome. Greetings. Grandpa Hoppy here. The Retirement Chronicles. My heading for today is, do you get lonely in retirement? That's a pretty topical subject in the retirement world. A lot of retirees maybe have lost a loved one, their spouse, or it could be that in my case, my wife still works and I'm retired. So there are lots of days where I sit home anxiously awaiting getting supper ready for her to get home from her work day. Many reasons why retired people get lonely. It could be that you never even were married and you're one of the chosen few that's been single. And I think that can also be a blessing doing work for the Lord. I think there's scripture that support that. I've heard that sermon before. But I think of a lot of times, our spouses may even pass on. And it brings me to remember my grandfather, Papa. We called him Papa Hoppa. My grandmother had passed away from cancer. And if you got noise in the background, that's my 3-year-old grandson playing with his little truck and trailer in the hallway. But I think back a lot to my grandfather, and actually I lived with him. He had cancer, and he lived right next door to my mom and dad, and lived alone. And I remember my dad coming to me and saying, "Hey," I was 18 years old, going to Northwest Community College, and I commuted to college, and he said he wanted me to live with him because he needed help. He was lonely, and not only is he lonely, he had cancer and elderly, and I'm trying to think back. I guess he was at that particular moment, I think he was probably around 78 years old. And but my grandmother had passed away years before. I'm not sure how many years, maybe 5 or 6 years. But I will remember this: my grandfather was lonely, but he wasn't too lonely. I didn't really know this until I moved in with him, that he had developed relationships with about 3 different elderly women. I knew this because I could hear him talking on the phone, and then I would ask questions, and he would tell me, he said, "Look, these are my friends I've come to know." He'd gone to church with one of them, and anyway, he had 3, and I said, "Do all 3 of them know that you're friends with all 3 of them?" He said, "Well, 2 of them know, but one of them doesn't know," and they would go out to eat and spend time with each other. But my grandfather, he said it can be real lonely being an elderly person and have nobody to talk to. So that's a real thing in retirement age. A lot of people go through loneliness. I think back when I was a FedEx courier, I used to go into all the retirement homes, and a lot of times back then, I went in there quite often. And we always had to get signatures back in the day. I don't think hardly anybody gets signatures anymore, but totally things have changed in the delivery world. But I really got to know a lot of the residents, and I would actually deliver to their rooms. Some of them were assisted living homes, and those are the ones I went to the rooms. But and then I would get to know even the residents that would sit out in the lobby. And if you go in there 3 times a week over a course of years, you end up knowing these people. And they would sit in the lobby because they were lonely and they wanted to have conversation. I've learned this in my own personal life, being retired 5 years. If you sit home for a week, sometimes a whole week, and you hadn't driven to town, and I live 12 miles from town, you could go a whole week without talking to anybody other than your spouse or somebody that's a relative. And then you tend to talk more because you hadn't talked all week, and just because you're lonely. And Wesley Meadows was one that was in Hernando, where I live, my hometown, that I went to the longest. I went to many, many retirement homes and assisted livings over the long years. I was a FedEx driver for 38 years. And so I've been in many, many, probably 30 different homes. And out of those 30, probably 10 that I became really, I went into a lot, anywhere from Jonesboro to Clarksdale to Batesville to Senatobia to all North Mississippi and many in Memphis. And you get to know people, and you get to talking. And I remember in Wesley Meadows, there was one lady, and this was years after my grandfather had passed away, 30 years later, maybe 25 to 30 years, 25 years later. One of the ladies that he was friends with, one of the three, was at Wesley Meadows, and she was in her 90s. And she shared with me that my grandfather was a very, very close friend. Little did she know I already knew, because I lived with him and heard the phone conversations from my grandfather's end. And he'd tell me who they were. And I got to talk with her a few times on the subject. And so it's a real thing. Being lonely as a retired person can be a real thing. Even me being married of a long time, over 3 decades, when me and my wife were separated apart from one another, not separated as a husband and wife, that's not what I mean. I mean physically separated. A lot of times I've come to Arkansas keeping and help raising my 2 grandchildren. My oldest son is divorced, and it works out better to tag team 2, the grandfather and the father. He gets his children every other week, and it's hard for a single parent to do that. And so since I'm retired, I come over to Arkansas and help him. My son is in a sales position. He's gone a lot in sales. And so it just works out better. And I come over here quite often, general routine. But I'm separated with my wife during that time. So we become lonely. We do a lot of FaceTiming and a lot of talking on the phone. And I'm sure people grow up and they do, or not grow up, but work their lives where they're like that. They're on the road for a week. Truck drivers, you're lonely, I'm sure. And you don't have to be old to be lonely. But elderly people, it's more loneliness. And we have to get adjusted to that, of being alone. It is an adjustment. There's alternatives to transfer that change. There's alternatives. There's ways that we can get engaged and be proactive and do things. And you can do that through church, or you can do that through organizations, or there's all kinds of clubs. Church is the best one to have those relationships. But then again, that's 3 times a week you go to church. Some go 3 times a week, but you can get engaged in ministry to help with that loneliness. One of the great ways to avoid loneliness, and maybe the best one, can be that can win the day, is having a pet. A pet can help in loneliness. One of the things is sometimes we outlive our survivors. And I've seen that in a lot of elderly people. And I've been to a funeral before where almost no one was there. And the real reason no one was there was because the person was so elderly, they outlived all the survivors that they loved and that loved them. And there was no one at the funeral because they all were dead. Well, I've got that saying that I did in episode 5, and this is episode 6, is gray hair is the crown of glory. So if you're one of those people that you're so old when you die and there was nobody at your funeral, odds is your gray hair is the crown of glory, and you just outlived everybody. And so with that being said, I'm going to say farewell for today. And so because he lives, from the Retirement Chronicles, you have a great day.